Pokemon is sort of infamous for not banning cards from the standard format. If they print an overpowered card, they usually let it plague the format for a while, and where most card games would ban the card, Pokemon instead prints a card that is meant to counter it. While there are many examples of this in the recent years, this is definitely not a new thing. In fact, this is a trend that we can trace all the way back to base set. We saw some of the most powerful trainer cards ever printed in the first ever set of Pokemon, and they were made even more powerful from the way the rules worked back then. There was no supporter item split, all trainers were just trainer cards, and they were treated as items are now, meaning that there was no limitation and we could play as many of each trainer card as we wanted every turn. So that meant it was even possible to play up to 4 Professor Oak on a single turn and turbo through the entire deck. Professor Oak is the same exact card as the Professor's Research card that we have now, but it was essentially an item card back then. While it might have been tempting to turbo through the entire deck on turn 1, that almost certainly would have been a mistake because of 2 trainer cards that really plagued the format in energy removal and super energy removal. Energy removal just said discard an energy from one of your opponent's Pokemon. Yeah, that's it. There was no coin flip required or anything like that. It just discarded an energy for free. And super energy removal said discard an energy attached to one of your own Pokemon in order to discard 2 energies attached to one of the opponent's Pokemon. These cards were kind of broken, especially when combined with other strong base set trainer cards. Games in the base set format are almost nothing like games are today. It was not uncommon for games to end by deck out, even when the goal of the decks were to take 6 prizes. While the energy removal cards weren't the only cards that contributed to this, they were certainly some of the biggest perpetrators. And this is where Pokemon had to decide if they were going to ban the problematic cards or find another way. They chose the latter and printed this Mewtwo promo. Now, it's a pretty simple card by today's standards, but it had an attack for 1 psychic energy that let the player attach 2 energy cards from their discard pile to their Mewtwo, and the second attack just did 40 damage, which doesn't seem like much, but back then it was a pretty solid attack, and it was enough to one-shot this Hitmonchan, which was the main attacker of the deck that used these energy removal cards the best. And now the precedent was set, where most card games would ban or limit the amount of copies of a card that a player could play in a deck. Pokemon was going to print cards to combat the problem instead. And since then, there really only has been one card ever banned from standard right after its print, and that was Lysander's Trump card. This card actually broke the game and removed a win condition, so countering it wasn't really an option and it just had to go. We also saw Belelba and Bryson Man and Miss Magius get banned more recently from standard, but that was after they saw legal play for a while. And of course there was the time that a card became so broken that it forced a mid-season rotation, but for the most part, we never see bans from the standard format. Instead, we usually see things like Giratina promo for Greninja Break, Karen for Night March, and more recently Jirachi for Sableye, or even Mightyena, Drapion V, and Spiritomb, all just to attempt to nerf Mew VMAX. While those were more targeted examples, some of the most impactful cards are meant to counter a format that has gotten out of hand. We've seen this done with some sort of way to nerf the use of items. In the past, item lock was just a part of the game, but more recently a card that punishes item use has been added to the game when a format reaches a critical mass of turbo item cards. And this led to what I believe to be one of the best designed cards ever printed in the Pokemon trading card game. And that is Trashalanche Garbodor. It was printed in a format with some of the best item cards the game has ever seen. Trainer's Mail, Max Elixir, and Verse Seeker were often 4-ofs in decks. And this was back when tools were still considered item cards, with Floatstone and Fighting Fury Belt being some of the best. And these item cards were still seeing an abundance of play in a format with Forest of Giant Plants and this item lock Vileplume. Forest of Giant Plants let grass Pokemon evolve the same turn they were put into play, and with the help of Shaman EX, it wasn't uncommon for Vileplume decks to go first and get a turn 1 Vileplume setup. Even with that, we saw plenty of turbo decks running high counts of these strong item cards, and the meta would flip-flop back and forth between turbo decks dominating one regional and then Decidueye Vileplume dominating the next. And that just kind of repeated until a pile of trash arrived to save the day. It was released in Guardians Rising, which was a very impactful set all around, but Garbodor was either the first or second best card in the set. It had a very simple attack for 1 Psychic Energy that said, this attack does 20 damage for each item card in the opponent's discard pile. That couldn't be that good though, right? If the opponent just doesn't play any item cards, this attack does 0 damage. Surely it wasn't that good. The first tournament that it was legal in the United States, this is what the top 16 looked like. Every deck in the top 16 either featured Garbodor or had a good matchup into it. Vespiquen Zoroark was a single prize deck, so it didn't really mind being one-shot by Trashalanche, and the Lapras deck could just choose to play the game very slowly and use Lapras's first attack Collect to draw a bunch of cards and slowly build up a Lapras to attack with. And every single other deck in the top 16 had this Trashalanche Garbodor, and it didn't stop there. This card was in almost every single other deck list in day 2. These Garb decks featured either Espeon GX or Drampa GX. These were both decent cards in their own time, but they were really just meant to put on pressure early game while the opponent's discard pile built up with items. The basic Pokemon EX back then had around 180 hit points on average, so Garb could one-shot them if they had just 9 items in the discard pile, or they could have 8 items if the Garb had a choice band on it. And it was really difficult with the way decks were built at the time to not play 9 items by the middle of the game. They also played the Garbotoxin Garbodor that shut off all abilities if it had a tool card attached to it. These decks were the perfect counter to the meta. Now at this point, I'm sure you're thinking, how could that possibly have been good for the game? There's one single card dominating the entire format. Well, that's only because lists hadn't adapted to the new format yet, and this is what the next North American major event looked like. There were 7 different decks in the top 8 alone. Garb decks were still good, but the rest of the meta evolved to be able to beat them. We even saw a slow stage 2 deck taking second place at this regional, which would have been almost unheard of before Guardians Rising came out. We even see Azul taking 7th place with a Volcanion deck, a deck that was once a very turbo deck, but it was now adapted to go a bit slower and play less item cards. Of course, anyone could still play their turbo decks with all their item cards and use a couple Shamans turn 1 and get 15 items in the discard pile and power up their attacker. They would then lose to 3 Trashalanche attacks in a row, but that's one of the reasons I believe it was the perfect counter card. It didn't completely suck the fun out of the game, and it forced everyone to think a little bit more about each item card that they played, but they still had the option to play them. This one card had changed the game entirely. Eventually, all these insanely strong items rotated, and Garb was still a solid card, but its power level decreased with the overall power level of the format. And that's the other thing that makes it such a well-designed card. It was very strong when it needed to be strong, and its power scaled with the power of the format around it. And I'm sure designing cards like this isn't easy, but it's something I wish Pokemon would do more often. Now, I'm not particularly anti-Badoo or anything like that, but just compare the two. Garbodor was like a nice gentle shove in the right direction, whereas Badoo is more like hooking a chain up to it and dragging it to the right direction. Let me know what you all think about videos like this in the comments below. I've been thinking about every once in a while just kind of doing a video about some point in history in the game, and I thought this was a pretty interesting part to start with. And I want to say thanks to Itzuel Sandoval. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And sorry if I pronounce the name wrong. I am terrible at reading screen names for some reason. And as always, a shout out and thanks to the channel members. I really appreciate it. And like or dislike, comment, subscribe, take care, and have a good one.